Hello, everyone. I'm Lana Zak.
And I'm Errol Barnett. We're continuing to follow breaking news out of Russia, where a business jet crash has killed 10 people.
Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin was listed as one of the passengers on the plane. Now, Russian officials say this jet was headed from Moscow to St. Petersburg when it crashed, killing all 10 people on board.
Now, authorities say Prigozhin was on the passenger list, but it's still unclear if the mercenary chief was actually on the aircraft.
And you may remember, back in June, Prigozhin led a short-lived rebellion against Russia's conventional army. He led thousands of mercenaries taking up weapons and marching from southern Russia toward Moscow with the aim of toppling the country's military leaders. The mutiny ended with a deal that was mediated by Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, under which Prigozhin was expected to then live in neighboring Belarus, exiled from Russia. He was supposed to be there with his men.
Now, since then, he refused to cede command of the Wagner Group and mostly stayed out of the public eye. That was until Monday, when video circulated of him, apparently in West Africa, reportedly in Niger, where he vowed to make the continent freer. Joining us now is retired U.S. Army Major and military analyst Mike Lyons. I first want to get your reaction to this news. We are trying to be careful with what's being reported from Russian state media because it doesn't always match up with the truth. But what do you make of these reports? How significant could this be?
They're significant. I'm surprised, probably not shocked. Knew he was always probably on a short list, but given the fact that he ran this mutiny about 2 months ago now, Vladimir Putin needed to kind of take inventory of the Wagner Group, which really had worked as his private mercenary army, not just within Ukraine, but in other parts of the world, in Syria, as well as Africa. And not forgiving what he did back then, the attempted overthrow of the military there. It was more of less a mutiny, not a coup, but not forgiving him. He takes inventory, finds out who he can and who he can't control, and then picks the time and place that he decides to take him out. So I am somewhat surprised. I knew he is an earner. He has a group of mercenaries that are going to likely avenge this. So this is not the end of it if he was killed in this crash. But again, I'm just surprised that it happened so quickly. Vladimir Putin must be very confident he's got control of this mercenary group now.
Well, very interesting, all of these details. After Wagner's short-lived rebellion, Prigozhin was exiled to Belarus. But according to the Associated Press, we hear that his plane was flying back and forth between the two countries. Do we know why that would be? Because it seems odd that after he was exiled, that his plane would be traveling between Moscow and St. Petersburg.
He must have felt confident enough that he could do that. And given the reports that it was shot down by Russian air defense systems, well inside of Moscow, usually, that's, if it wasn't on the border, it couldn't be mistaken for some kind of Ukraine incident, some kind of border incident. It's clear that they thought he was on that plane and he was shot out of it. So it's just easier way to travel. He might have lulled himself into this false sense of security. Maybe he thought that he was going to survive this. We saw pictures of him training the Belarusian military that we're got to be concerned about the Wagner Group there. As they border Poland, they have those other countries, Latvia, Estonia, those countries there that the Wagner Group threatens. They are the little green men that initially started this back in 2014. So it's all part of a kind of a web that has been woven for the past 7 or 8 years. He must have felt confident with it, and then fell asleep from a security perspective and didn't think this was going to happen.
And Mike, I know that this has just happened. We're just seeing these reports in the last few hours. But is it clear to you, or are you getting any hints as to who else may have been on this aircraft, particularly if Russian President Putin wants to make it seem as if this was, justice in the making?
Well, it looks like also Dmitry Yutin, the number 2 person at the Wagner Group, was also on the manifest as well. Kind of a neo-Nazi character, more or less hardliners when it came to Russian military. And if that's the case, again, he decapitates this group thinking he's going to put somebody else in charge of it. There's about 20 to 25,000 individuals within the Wagner Group that can project power within Russia and especially outside of Russia. They're earners. If you use that mafia family analogy, Prigozhin was an earner, which is why he wasn't probably taken out right away when this happened 2 months ago. But as Vladimir Putin does the math and figures out that he can finally get rid of him in a way and still continue the earning of the Wagner Group, he goes from there. But taking out the number 2 person as well. If he died in that same plane crash, he must be confident he's got someone to step in and take their place.
And we should note just that bit of caution that we still do not have confirmed reports that either of them were on that plane when it went down. They were reportedly on the manifest, but the information that we're getting at this point is largely coming from Russian state media. Mike Lyons, Thank you.
Thanks.
Joining us now is Catrina Doxsee. She is the Associate Director and Associate Fellow, Transnational Threats Project at CSIS. So talk to us a little bit just about this backstory of Prigozhin's relationship with Russia, with Vladimir Putin, and with other military officials.
So Prigozhin has been instrumental in leading the Wagner Group's efforts to spread Russian foreign policy goals abroad and to act as a force multiplier. This has been going on for about a decade. Wagner first formed in 2014 after that invasion of Ukraine. And many of their deployments have really been focused in Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where they've been able to spread Moscow's influence while also securing economic and financial gains in the form largely of natural resource exploitation. Most recently, they began to play a larger and larger role in Ukraine, ultimately taking on almost the role of an informal unit fighting on the front lines, particularly in the area around Bakhmut. And that's when we started to see a lot of the clashes happening between Prigozhin and leadership in the Ministry of Defense in Russia, particularly with Defense Minister Shoigu and Gerasimov, who is leading efforts in Ukraine. We saw that Prigozhin was openly criticizing them, perhaps more so than anyone expected would be allowed from someone within Russia. And it's been speculated that Putin allowed this criticism and this infighting to go on in such a public way because he was able to play the different sides off of one another so as to limit all sides without himself having to step in. We saw things, of course, get out of hand in June when Prigozhin led a mutiny directed primarily against the Ministry of Defense after they imposed a July 1st deadline for Wagner troops to sign contracts and become a part of the Russian Ministry of Defense. And that, I think, was where Prigozhin really overstepped. This was perceived as a threat to Putin himself, and we've seen the deterioration of their relationship since. We've seen a lot of questions moving forward about the future of the Wagner Group, the future of Prigozhin himself, and if it turns out that the reports are true that he really was on board this plane, of course, with both his name and the name of his second-in-command, Dmitry Utkin, on that passenger list, I think then this really is the next big step in seeing the evolution of how Moscow will continue to use this sort of semi-private entity going forward, presumably with other leadership at the helm.
Really fascinating observations you mentioned there, Catrina. And what's noteworthy to me, as we heard from our retired U.S. Army Major Mike Lyons, is that the Wagner Group is roughly 20 to 25,000 people. So if we are to believe then that Yevgeny Prigozhin and his number 2 have been killed as a result of this plane crash, what then becomes of the rest of the group? The invitation to participate in Niger with its junta and instability, as well as other Russian efforts, I guess, around the world?
I think that really is the core question now. Up until this point, we've seen that there hasn't really been a viable successor to Wagner. There hasn't been an alternative that could clearly step in to take their place. And I believe that that's part of why Putin has allowed Wagner to continue operating, particularly in the African theater, which is where the majority of their activities and really their benefits have been located. We've seen that there was a slight attempt following the mutiny to explore other leadership options. The person that Putin tried to tap there was not willing to take over. And there really are no other rival private military companies that are at the same scale and level to be able to take over. That said, it's also unlikely that Russia would want to fully remove the operational infrastructure that Wagner has built up in these countries, particularly in light of the relationships that they've built and the experience that men on the ground have gained. Now, the big question, I think, in terms of how you institute new leadership, how you ensure that that leadership remains loyal to Russia, is also how you manage all of those thousands of fighters. The ones in Belarus, certainly the ones who have long been operating in these various countries in Africa, in Syria, in Latin America, because if if these reports are true, if Prigozhin was killed in this plane crash, shot down by Russian air defenses, we've already seen that Wagner channels are running wild online with these reports that Prigozhin was killed by the Russian state. And I think that there will be a big question of loyalty going forward. As much as Moscow won't want to disrupt that operational infrastructure and those relationships that have been built with host countries, I think there will be a very serious question of where the loyalty of those troops lie, whether it's to Prigozhin and in resenting the Russian state for killing him, or whether that loyalty can be won back to Moscow.
Or whether it silences any dissenters. That's potentially part of it, too, Catrina. We understand that President Biden has, in fact, been briefed on this reported plane crash in Russia. And I just wanted to ask you, what would be the international response if it does turn out that this was an assassination attempt?
I think that certainly we'll see some caution in terms of dealing with the Russian state itself, much as we have around the time of the mutiny. But I think that really the big opportunity for U.S. and Western policy at this point will be in looking at some of those further abroad deployments that Wagner has been deeply involved in the context in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, where Wagner has been instrumental to maintaining security in a number of these countries, places like Mali, the Central African Republic, and where now there may be a vacuum forming if there is all of this uncertainty about the transition of leadership for Wagner. And even if there isn't a power vacuum there, I think there's certainly a huge moment of uncertainty where you have local actors who are now unsure where their security assistance will come from. And most importantly, for many of these regimes that were relying on Wagner for really a coup-proofing function and preserving their own hold on power, there starts to be an existential question there. So I think that aside from the question of how do we deal with Russia moving forward, I think there are a lot of opportunities for the United States and other Western partners to look to these countries that are now potentially adrift, looking for new security assurances, looking for new security support and support for good governance. And I think that those conversations need to be happening as soon as possible to explore ways that the US or other Western allies could provide viable alternatives to the services that these regimes have found in Wagner.
Yeah, and with all the questions that we have, we do know that there will be some type of consequence to this development, the power structure in Russia really shifting. Catrina, Doxsee, thank you so much for speaking with us on CBS News today.